The Fire Next Time, written by James Baldwin, project by Ava Tolan. James Baldwin was born on August 2nd, 1924 in Harlem, New York, and died on December 1st, 1987 in St. Paul de Vence, France. He was a prominent writer, playwright, and activist of the Civil Rights Movement. His work demonstrated what it meant to be a gay black man in America and explored many social and racial issues. One of his most famous books is The Fire Next Time. The Fire Next Time was published in 1962. It is comprised of 2 essays, My Dungeon Shook, Letter to My Nephew on the 100th Anniversary of the Emancipation, and Down at the Cross, Letter from a Regent in My Mind. The first essay is a letter to his nephew reflecting on the state of the country 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863. He concludes that the U.S. has not actually experienced any growth in the area of racial dynamics in the century since the proclamation. The second essay focuses on the life of a black American and how politics and religion heavily influence a black American's life. He uses anecdotes from his own life with his time as a youth minister, as well as conversations he had with the leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad. Baldwin came to the conclusion that the United States, a country supposedly dedicated to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, has not done a proper job in fulfilling that task when it comes to the livelihood of black Americans. The Fire Next Time is a world classic. It is timeless. It is a great piece that examines racial dynamics and how race, politics, and religion were perceived and interchangeable during the Civil Rights Movement. It provides people of all races with an incredibly honest perspective of racism and how embedded it is in our society. Baldwin's arguments about how racism impacts our society are relevant even today, proving just how classic the book is. Whether shown through a continuance of our society's status quo, activist movements for equality like those of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, as well as the recent Black Lives Matter protests, religious influence in African American culture, James Baldwin's theme and perspective on race in The Fire Next Time is everlasting. In My Dungeon Shook, Letter to My Nephew on the 100th Anniversary of the Emancipation, on page 10, Baldwin notes how slaves were freed 100 years ago, but the country is celebrating 100 years of freedom 100 years too soon. At the time of its publication, the Civil Rights Act hadn't passed yet, and it was passed 2 years later, so segregation in public places like parks, courthouses, restaurants, hotels, arenas, and theaters was still legal. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, regarded as one of the most important laws for equality, banned the use of literary tests for voters and poll taxes, and it was also yet to be passed. This statement about celebrating freedom 100 years too soon could be even proved true today. For example, look at prisons in America. The United States prison system disproportionately punishes African Americans. According to the NAACP, 32% of the U.S. population is African American and Hispanic, while 56% of the U.S. incarcerated population are African Americans and Hispanics. Nationwide, African American children represent 32% of children who are arrested and 42% of children who are detained, yet African American children represent only 14% of the population. The imprisonment rate for African American women is double that of white women. If African Americans and Hispanics were incarcerated at the same rates as white people were, prisons and jail populations would decline by almost 40%. So if the United States were truly free, then the imprisonment rates would be equal. The negative effects of incarceration also show that celebrating freedom is still premature. According to the NAACP, many of the formerly incarcerated also suffer from a loss of their rights as a result of their records. In 34 states, people who are on parole or probation cannot vote, and in 12 states, a felony conviction means never voting again. People are not truly free if they cannot vote. Baldwin's work is very influential and has withstood the test of time. It provides not only insight into and encouragement for, but a foreshadowing analysis of present-day activist movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement and its protests. Orlando Edmonds says, "Openness to radical forms of expression is essential to reaching radical goals." While some may criticize the Black Lives Matter movement for not being respectable enough or too dramatic, Baldwin would most likely applaud the movement for its demands because he said, "There is no possibility of a real change in the Negro situation without the most radical and far-reaching changes in the American political and social structure." This directly correlates with his argument in My Dungeon Shook. By arguing that the country has not made any steps forward since the Emancipation Proclamation, he proves that the only viable way to achieve equality between white and black people is to undergo dramatic change, which is strikingly similar to the mindsets of current black activist leaders. Today, people are protesting against police violence and arguing for a dismantling of the current police system and the formulation of a replacement. Edmonds says this would be addressed by targeting the laws and practices of state-sanctioned violence, not by being accepted to join the executors, and you can't expect to arrive at a radical form of democracy, as it were, by walking down a road that history has proven to be a cul-de-sac. This raises the question that Baldwin asked in the book: do I really want to be integrated into a burning house? Like Edmonds says, does it make sense to try to formulate the solution to a problem in the terms of the society that produced that said problem? The two, Baldwin and Edmonds, along with present-day activists, believe that it doesn't make any sense to reform or join a corrupt system to make it better. The only way to eradicate any problems is by dismantling the system that enforces these problems. Baldwin's belief that there is no way for racial equality to be reached without radical change in our political and social structure is proven by the lack of change in the country in the century since the Emancipation Proclamation, and even today, with current incarceration statistics and ongoing demands by black leaders. His question, do I really want to be integrated into a burning house, is still highly thought on today, proving just how influential and timeless Baldwin's work is. Every Negro boy, in my situation during those years at least, who reaches this point realizes, at once, profoundly, because he wants to live, that he stands in great peril and must find with speed a thing, a gimmick, to lift him out, to start him on his way. And it does not matter what the gimmick is. It was this last realization that terrified me, and, since it revealed that the door opened on so many dangers, helped to hurl me into the church, and by an unforeseeable paradox, it was my career in the church that turned out precisely to be my gimmick. Baldwin says that every young black boy at his time needed to find a gimmick to get interested in and to protect them and give them joy. James Baldwin got involved in his local church because it provided him with a light and sense of hope. Church leaders, like Martin Luther King Jr., played a major role in organizing marches and events to further the civil rights movement. People like Martin Luther King Jr. preached Christianity and its ideals of peace to help black people fight for equality. On page 50, Baldwin mentions Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, and how important religion is to black communities. Elijah Muhammad has been able to do what generations of welfare workers and committees and resolutions and reports and housing projects and playgrounds have failed to do: to heal and redeem drunkards and junkies, to convert people who have come out of prison and to keep them out, to make men chaste and women virtuous, and to invest both the male and the female with a pride and a serenity that hang about them like an unfailing light. Where the government has failed to provide for black people, religion has replaced. Churches and mosques serve their community with charity, hope, and a family. Robert Joseph Taylor and Linda M. Chatters researched the role of religion in the lives of African Americans. They said, Black churches have a long tradition of spearheading social, educational, and health services to their congregations and surrounding communities, including youth programs, economic development initiatives, programs for the elderly and their caregivers, income maintenance, and job training programs. Another example of religion empowering African Americans is the name change movement. Islam provided African Americans with a sense of power by allowing people to change their names from the last names of their ancestors' masters to be Arabic Islamic names instead. This was such a widespread movement throughout the 50s and 60s, with examples including Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Religion is still very prevalent in Black American pop culture. Many rappers use Christian themes and talk about how religion is so important in African American life. For example, Kendrick Lamar's album, Good Kid, Mad City, reinstates what Baldwin said about how religion provides so much for Black people and a safe space and form of welfare. Lamar's album talked about how kids in Compton are exposed to violence, drugs, and gangs, and how Christianity provides a way for kids to not succumb to these things. In his song, Good Kid, Lamar says, "No better picture to paint than me walking home from Bible study," and called his homies because he had said he noticed my face. "Step on my neck and get blood on your Nike checks." Lamar references how some kids got involved with the church to stray away from gang violence, while some of their peers sadly got involved in the gang violence. This is remarkably similar to Baldwin's time as a youth minister. Norcott Mahoney says, "He fled to the church in part because it offered apparent safety from the dangers of the street, a counter to the hustlers and dealers." So this shows how Baldwin and Kendrick Lamar went to the church to stay away from violence. J. Cole's album, Born Sinner, and almost all of Kanye West's albums, as well as songs by Tupac and Chance the Rapper, are still heavily influenced by Christianity as well. The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin provides an unsparing view of racial dynamics in the United States. The first essay examines how liminal change has occurred in the centuries since the Emancipation Proclamation. He says, because of this lack of change, the country is celebrating 100 years of freedom 100 years too soon. However, Baldwin believes this freedom cannot be achieved without dramatic changes to our political and social structures. This belief is so timeless that it can be proved by demands from present-day Black Lives Matter protest leaders and incarceration rates. His second essay explores the importance of religion in a Black American's life and how, in many cases, it does the job of the government by providing social and economic resources and protection to Black Americans. This is made evident by Baldwin's time as a youth minister, the work of Elijah Muhammad and Islam in empowering and providing for Black Americans, the work of church leaders throughout the civil rights movement, and 21st century rappers' use and analysis of Christianity in their albums. All of James Baldwin's arguments can be proven true today, showing just how timeless his work is. The Fire Next Time is a tremendously influential world classic.